numbers are slowing a little bit, but if anyone struggles in, they'll be able to join along. Just to kick off, thank you everyone for joining us today. We're excited to have this Fireside with Zaheer and Zuhayeer. We'll go a little bit into some of the topics that we talked about or sent out in the forum around comp negotiations and leveling and remote work. We'll even talk about how, I'm sure we can bring up the story of how you guys are named so similarly and what that meant for you. But just to send out some reminders, we will spend the first part of this conversation going through the topics, and it'll be back and forth with myself and Zaheer and Zuhayeer. And then if there's any questions, you guys are able to post those at the bottom. There is a QA button where you can put them in. We'll go through those at the end and answer them live. If you want to send them over chat, one of the Pequity team members will take those and make sure that they end up in the open QA, just in case anyone has any technical issues. And we do want to remind you this will be recorded and shared later. So I'll go ahead and just kick off with some self-introductions briefly before we turn over to the main event. But my name is Kaitlyn. I'm the founder of Pequity. I've been in the compensation space for about the past 10 years, working at Google, Cruise Automation, Instacart, and then consulting at a ton of other companies on their compensation processes. So love the space, deep in it. With Pequity, we do a lot of things around making you more competitive with compensation and helping companies compensate with competence, as we say. And part of that is obviously data. So we partnered with Levels.fyi recently to use their data across some of our customer base. And I got to know Zaheer and Zuhayeer much better from that. So I'll turn it over to them, let them introduce themselves before we kind of jump into the meat of the conversation.
Yeah. Hey, everyone. Great to be here, and thanks for the introduction, Kaitlyn. I'm Zaheer, one of the co-founders of Levels.fyi.
Hey, I'm Zaheer, the other co-founder, and as you just heard, I am a beekeeper. If you were here earlier in the conversation. But yeah, just to give a little background on Levels, we started a couple of years ago, and our mission is to help people make better career decisions. And the way we do that is we collect all sorts of data about companies and roles to help people make those decisions. So some of the data that we collect is salaries, benefits, and we really like to focus on accuracy. And so whenever possible, we try to actually verify either with the company directly or from using verified sources, the salaries and the benefits, or anything really that we collect.
Awesome. And to kind of loop back a little bit, so, about your guys' names, I understand from what you've told me that that's actually how you guys met and kind of, in a way, the catalyst for Levels.fyi. So do you want to share that story?
Yeah, totally. So yeah, our names are very similar, as you can notice, and it's always a problem in every Zoom call, but it's actually the reason we met. So one of our friends, Khwaja, he went to Berkeley with me, and we went to Berkeley together, but he was originally from Irvine, which is where Zaheer went to school. So he kind of came up this one weekend and was telling me, hey, there's this guy named Zaheer. He likes to work on side projects just like you. You should meet up with him. Turns out, we both lived and grew up in the Bay Area. So one summer we decided to meet up and just talk to each other casually, and eventually just started working on kind of what was the beginning of Levels.fyi as like a side project for fun. And we found this problem of kind of we were kind of browsing through a bunch of forums and online kind of communities, and found this problem where people would constantly ask the question about what level they should be placed at a specific company if they were to switch. And so we thought that's a very kind of interesting issue that like a lot of engineers face, and there's no visual tool to kind of help with that. And so we decided to build like a very simple leveling tool to just help people compare leveling across the 3 major companies. And very quickly, we posted the link on some of these forums, and people started posting it themselves and kind of referencing it. And we realized, this is like a pretty big deal. And in the beginning, we actually didn't even have compensation. It was just strictly leveling. And in a way, we kind of stumbled into that space. And then and we added kind of compensation to the leveling information, and it's sort of grown from there. But yeah, that's sort of like an overview of how we kind of got started, and it's been, I think, almost 4 years now. So pretty crazy journey.
Oh, that's awesome. I mean, what a way to kind of meet your co-founder.
Yeah.
It's a great story. And, something that was one of the key topics for tonight that you guys just kind of hinted on was that you stumbled into the compensation space, which makes sense to me. As a compensation manager, leveling and compensation goes hand in hand. In fact, for anyone who didn't know, when you go through like SOC 2 compliance or anything like that, they ask you if you have leveling structures. They ask you if you have compensation ranges and ways to evaluate your employees. So it's actually usually a regulated thing that you have to do. So I'm curious for you guys with compensation negotiations, how did it start really from the beginning, and what are you guys doing today?
Yeah. It was interesting. So after we released like the salary information and started collecting that, we started to get a lot of questions from our users around how to actually negotiate their compensation. They'd see, for example, a lot of people would like filter like from the highest to lowest. People like to know like, okay, what's the max that people can get paid and things. And so they'd see these numbers and they'd be like, okay, so how can I get paid that much? And people would ask us how to negotiate, and we try to help them out as much as possible through our. We have a little chat widget on the site. Eventually, we realized there's a real need there, and even though there's like a plethora of like information online about how to negotiate, some people just want kind of to chat with someone of how to actually negotiate. They want that live kind of feedback and help, and so we started a service to actually help people negotiate their offers. And we actually hired a former recruiter. She used to work at a lot of the top tech companies, and she would actually negotiate on the other side of the table as a recruiter, and she would negotiate offers with folks. And so we hired her to actually help candidates now negotiate job offers. And it's been really interesting and kind of an really almost enlightening experience in some sense, where we've seen in how much variability there is in pay, as well as in some cases we've seen people negotiate 20-30%, and for some of those situations we've actually even re-leveled candidates. So just I think last week we had a candidate where they actually completely re-leveled the candidate to meet the compensation expectations. And a lot of it I think comes down to really it's, we kind of help guide people by really crafting their own narrative, right? So they already have a story. A lot of times these folks are already fairly qualified, but it's really around strengthening their profile and strengthening how they present themselves. It's interesting because, in some cases, these folks don't know necessarily how to present themselves. And really all we're doing by helping them negotiate is really helping them perfect that. And as a result of that, they're able to fetch what their true value may be.
That's
Yeah.
awesome.
Yeah, totally. And I think one of the things we've kind of learned on the way too is, it really comes down back to like leveling in some sense. Compensation bands are set to leveling. And so the ranges you kind of can interpret from the level that you're kind of going in for, which is why we also think, there's like a common misconception around negotiation just being something that happens at the end where you flick a switch and just ask for, some more money. But really it's a relationship that the company is building with the candidate is building with the company, and you're kind of going through this journey together as you interview and as you kind of get the offer. And so you're really negotiating throughout that process and trying to figure out, which level you're going to be placed at, what your responsibility is going to look like. And from that, you can really interpret, what the range for your role might be.
I completely agree. And, from my own experience being the one who usually is on the one behind the recruiters, right? Like they're negotiating forward, and it's usually a policy that I'm trying to adhere to. It's hard, and it's this weird double-edged sword where the recruiter wants to do what's best for the candidate, right? And the candidate doesn't have the perfect information because there isn't really one number that, I was asked recently by someone that we're consulting with. They mentioned like, why do there have to be different ranges? Like, why couldn't every company just pay a software engineer the same amount? And that's very idealized. And of course, from the data, maybe they could if everyone chose to peg the exact same part of the market and was going for the exact same talent, maybe that would be the truth. But because it is so varied and budgets change and companies are companies and they have secret sauces to their pay structures, it just doesn't happen that way. And that makes it confusing for people who come in. And generally, when people, I always ask, what do you recommend I say then? They're going to ask me what my desired comp is. And I always advise not to give a number, even though I know that would help recruiting. But the most beneficial thing from a negotiation standpoint is to try and kick it down the road. What I say whenever I go into interviews is I want to be paid commensurate with my responsibility and role. Because the truth is, I am coming to a new company. I'm going into a new role. I want it to match that structure. And that way it kind of puts the onus back on them. And it doesn't set off that bad expectation, I feel, with recruiters, because you don't want to say, oh, I actually want to be paid X. And then they give you the final offer and you're like, oh, I want to change something. Because I think that's where the sense of friction or betrayal with the recruiter comes in.
Yeah.
But I'm curious from you guys, you've seen a lot of negotiations. What kind of advice would you say that you've seen work?
Yeah. It's that's certainly, I think, probably the first piece of advice is like, a lot of candidates will either say their current salary or say like a number in mind right away, and it's a kind of like, it's almost the first mistake that they make, but it has repercussions throughout the entire process. And so definitely the top number one advice we usually give, like the first thing that we'll say to people is like, hey, be careful about revealing your compensation expectations. In a lot of cases, it can hurt you, and in a lot of cases it really just doesn't benefit you, right? And so that's probably one of the first things. The second thing that we see a lot is people may have a misunderstanding of the level that they're applying to, or the company may be misunderstanding them in terms of what level they are placed at. And so the second thing really that we do is we look at the level, make sure that it's matched up, because at the end of the day, if they're misaligned on level, then they're going to be definitely misaligned on pay, most likely. And so ensuring that they're aligned at the correct level. And then after that, it's really about kind of helping them craft their narrative, why they would be the best person for the role, and why they should truly get whatever they're asking for in the negotiations, right? And so far it's been interesting in terms of also the type of, one thing that I found interesting was like the type of folks that we see that come to ask us for help negotiating. We'll see a lot of people that are like, from minority groups or from underrepresented groups in general. And, I think part of that is a lot of it comes down to confidence as well, right? And so one of the biggest things that we do really for folks is also instill confidence in them, right? I can't count how many times a person will be like, oh, like, do you really think I should ask for this much? Like, is it okay to ask for this much? And we're like, yes, it's okay. Definitely, like, we got your back. Like, don't worry, you can do this. So a lot of it is just instilling confidence in people. And I think that's like a huge thing that all folks have to realize, is that like, on both sides of the table, right? From a company perspective and from a candidate perspective, some people just don't have the confidence to negotiate. And so when you're looking at paying folks as well, if you're relying on them to negotiate to get to an equitable number or something like that, then that's something to keep in mind, that not everyone negotiates. But also at the same time, you may want to factor in some room for that as well.
Yeah, I think that said, like we also, we're working towards making this information available for people so that they kind of have an accurate understanding of what they can ask for and how much they really could be asking for, like really. And that plays into the whole confidence thing, is like data kind of gives you that confidence because you have the information to be able to go and say, hey, I want this much, or what have you. And I think we also learned that like you kind of build your offer with your kind of company together, and kind of by spitting like out a first number with like initially, whether it's your current salary or just an expectation you have in mind, you've kind of like submitted an offer already. Like that's like something that like you aren't building it as you go. And so that's sort of been kind of like a or it's sort of like a misstep on the candidate's part, which kind of gets you a lowball offer. But over time, like as you kind of go through an interview process, or you go through one of these kind of experiences with a company, you want to build your offer with the company as you go. And usually that means, you'll be going back and forth, having conversations, and it's usually like a mutually beneficial conversation because you're both trying to, be helpful to each other at the end of the day.
Yeah. No, and I mean, I'm sure too during COVID and the pandemic that people are probably more nervous. And the thing I know we have spoken about before was this fear that an offer is going to be rescinded, right? And I can say that 99% of the time it will never be rescinded, and that 1% where it might happen, you don't want to work for that company. But the big companies, especially like if you're looking at FANG, Google, Facebook, LinkedIn, any reputable company has built their program for negotiations. Pequity actually we build the compensation systems for companies so they can come in, and if they don't have one, we help build it. And it's purposely built so you can negotiate, because we know it's going to happen. As little, as imperfect information as everyone out there in the world has, we have equally imperfect information on that person. So it's not that we have some log somewhere that says, John Smith is paid X. It's more that we have an idea of what the market suggests is the labor rate for a role. We're relying on that with some accuracy. And we now have to fit John Smith into our structure, which includes different levels, expectations, and may not align to everything. So for anyone who is fearful, you can have it from me. If there's a company who uses Pequity's programs out there that's built to negotiate, it doesn't mean that you will get a raise or any sort of increase just because you do negotiate, but you should never be afraid to bring it up or to ask for it.
And that's huge, I think, for people to know, is just, that alone, I think, can help inspire a ton of confidence in folks when they are trying to negotiate or evaluating an offer.
Yeah, just knowing whether you can negotiate or not. And sometimes I also think, like coming into the initial process, like sometimes there is like a misalignment of incentive, or just misalignment of expectations. Like if you, for example, are looking to come in at an E4 level, but the company's considering you for the E3 level, it's just a really tough situation for both parties if the expectations just aren't there, which is why we encourage folks, like at the beginning, just make sure to kind of clear that up and communicate, like over communicate kind of, even to just make sure you're on the same page, and that way you can have like a very pleasant experience through both parties, right? So
yeah. I'm curious actually from your end, like when you're developing a comp plan, like is there also a plan for negotiating? Like, is it so formal where you actually have a plan or run book for negotiations, or is that kind of loose?
It's formally loose. So we, when we train recruiters, we do train them to negotiate. And generally what that looks like is we have a range. And because we don't know where people fall, I try to build something that I think is competitive, that we look at the market, we're like, this should close people. And so based off that range of competitiveness, we tell recruiters, because we don't know where they're at, we don't know what they're going to negotiate within. The best practice is we want to bring in most new hires, and we define it as experience. So I look at it as someone who's new to the role, new to the responsibilities, maybe has never done it before. That person would start at the bottom of the range. And as we progress up and we see, oh, they're more experienced, or we think they could hit the ground running, no training needed, those are signals to me that they might need further compensation. But I follow that math because I have other people within the company who don't need training. They are meeting all expectations. And so I want that new hire to align to where the performers are. So that's why we built that range system, because obviously for everyone who is employed, it doesn't feel good when a new hire comes in and they're paid more than you. So that's what we're trying to solve for, while at the same time getting you in the door and keeping you competitive. So it is kind of a formal process. Obviously, I don't have the perfect information of where someone's going to negotiate in, and sometimes people do negotiate under the range. And I always tell people you have to bring them at least to the bottom of range. I don't care if it's a 50% increase for them. If they pass the bar and we think they're good, that's where they should be paid. And if they're over our target, sometimes it's a conversation of, can we afford them? Like if they're truly making that in the market, I might not be able to meet it. And just because someone else is paying them that, it might not fit our budget. We're a business at the end of the day. So we might not be, might have to
Yeah,
let
yeah.
the show. And that's a hard conversation with recruiting. I think it's hard on the candidate too.
Hmm.
But if that does come up, you can always ask, and recruiters will usually tell you like, hey, it's outside the price. It's like outside what you make today. And that
Yeah,
can
yeah.
be for you that there might be a leveling issue.
Hmm.
Which
Yeah.
does come back
Yeah.
to an interesting thing with leveling for you guys, because
Hmm.
that is the bread and butter.
Yep.
Um, and so I'd love to hear, I know there's like a little bit of you gave a brief overview of how you guys started with it, but Zaheer, I believe it was your journey that kind of also
Yeah.
kicked off all the Levels.fyi studying for the levels, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So it was interesting when I was, this is a couple of years ago. So around the time that I met Zaheer, I was actually in the middle of transitioning jobs. So I used to work at LinkedIn. I had gotten promoted at LinkedIn to a senior software engineer, which is like the second level at LinkedIn. And I wanted to make sure that when I joined my next company, I was actually going to be leveled at the right level. And it's interesting because I was interviewing and I had offers from two very distinct companies in terms of how their leveling schemes work. So I had one offer from Netflix and I had another offer from Amazon. And if you're familiar with Netflix, then you'll know that they only really have one level. So
Yeah.
there's only just senior software engineer across the board. And I mean, I was super confused at the time. I was like, okay, what does that mean? I guess like I can only come in at one level, so I'm probably, there's no concerns there in some sense, right? But at Amazon, I also wanted to make sure that, okay, I was going to come at whatever the equivalent leveling scheme is, and they called it something completely different. Like at LinkedIn, we had regular software engineer, senior staff, and so on. While at Amazon, the senior engineer was actually the third level. And so I was thinking, oh, maybe I should come in at the senior engineer because it sounds the same. But it was actually not the right level. The second level would be the correct one for me. And so we started digging. That's really when we started digging into this, and we also saw other people having the same sorts of questions. And then one of the natural questions that arises is, how do you actually compare levels across companies, right? And I think what a lot of folks, we get this question all the time actually, where people will come and say, hey, the pay at this company for this level is this much, and while at some other company it's this much, and the pay doesn't necessarily align at each level, and that's because pay is not necessarily leveling is not a function of pay. It's the inverse, right? Pay is a function of leveling, and different companies can set different rates for their pay. And so what we realize is leveling is actually based on the roles and responsibilities of an individual at the company, right? It's based on what they're delivering. For example, I might be leading a team, or I might be expected to deliver a project independently, things like that. And so we started actually collecting, for example, the leveling rubrics at companies. So like Amazon has like a leveling rubric. I know many companies do, Google and whatnot, and they have these guides essentially for their own internal engineers, or to actually define what each level means, what are the roles and responsibilities. And that's really what we use to actually come up with the mapping of leveling that we have. And really, if you want to figure out your level, it's we've actually even come up with a standard, because we saw a lot of patterns across this, and to kind of generify it and abstract it out, we now have like a leveling standard where you can see, okay, at the first level, these are the typical responsibilities. At the second level, these are the typical, and whatnot, and so on.
Yeah. And it's true. I mean, leveling, it can be very bespoke by company. Google has some extremes out there because they're going for the cream of the crop, and they can put some ICs paid on par with execs or VPs, which is crazy.
Mm-hmm.
But generally speaking,
Yeah.
we try to follow these structures, and it's driven a lot by, interestingly, the compensation surveys, because I have to build that level system that ties to comp, and that means I take the surveys, and if anyone's done any Googling on like leveling or comp data out there, you'll find Radford has a very set structure. It's only 6 levels. And so someone like me has to filter all of my levels into their 6 and then pull back out into whatever structure I've created. There is generally this like shared DNA, so to speak, across the Bay or across any industry, where you can feel like a senior is a senior, or staff is a staff, and it's probably driven by some of those examples. But it is so critical to compensation. And I do find it interesting. how much it can influence pay. And something I've always been sensitive to, and that we're, with Pequity, what we try and help solve with offers, we evaluate if people coming in at the same level are paid significantly similar. And you can even set it up to compare like gender or under minority status for certain people in your company. Because you'll find sometimes that individuals won't notice that there might be a discrepancy, and they're so excited to work at a company that they won't negotiate, because it does kick off a painful releveling process. And to your point, that can impact certain demographics more than others. And it's just a misunderstanding, right? Like they could have probably been at the different level, but they just didn't know to ask. So I think your tool is super, super powerful. And it kind of, in that world of complexity and leveling, I think this year is completely turning compensation on its head, because we now have, remote work tagging right on top of it for candidates who now have to figure out, how do I negotiate when there's not, I know what a software engineer makes in San Francisco, but do I know what they make in the middle of Nebraska or Kansas City?
Yeah, it's I mean, it's so complex now, I think, and like even from like a data collection and analyzing that data perspective, I think there's a lot that we'll have to figure out. But at the same time, what's actually, and we've actually gotten a lot of questions from people, from compensation managers and even hiring managers, who are confused about this right now, as it's like a super timely thing. And I mean, personally, I've actually just been pointing them to Pequity's relocation. I believe you guys call it the Relocation Calculator. Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's, I mean, I thought it was a great resource. But I mean, I think the other thing to keep in mind with this is companies have also been doing this for a long time, right? And so from a consumer, or like from a candidate perspective, I think there's a lot of confusion around, okay, is this something new? Like, what's going on? How's my pay going to be impacted? But I think it's worth like acknowledging that, okay, companies have been doing this. There's a set sort of protocol in some ways that they have done. Now, there are new aspects to this where, for example, it's much more common that people are moving locations, and so adjusting pay based on that trigger or things like that will become much more of an issue. But like on this note, I think there's a difference, something that, I mean, would catch me, like, or something that would confuse me initially, is like that difference between cost of location and cost of labor, and how those are two different things, right? And how in one area the cost of living might be high, but the cost of labor may be the same as potentially another area, right? And cost of living is more so, for folks that aren't super aware, cost of living is really the cost of things like how much is your rent, or how much is food, and so on, things like that. Whereas the cost of labor is actually like, from my understanding, and you're probably more of an expert here, but cost of labor is what people are actually getting paid in that area, right? And those are two different things. And although they might be closely related, it's not always the case, right?
Yeah, no, that hits it on the head. For me, a lot of candidates and people I talk with, it is confusing, right? It's like, well, if I want to live in San Francisco, I need to be paid more.
Right.
We say yes, like that is true, and that's why we look at cost of labor, because people would not accept those jobs, I would hope, unless they could actually live there off of those wages. And the greatest difference I can use to explain actually comes from Frank Wagner, who's VP of Comp at Google, was my old boss, and I love this example because it really pronounces the difference. But a house that's in Kansas City, like a typical 3-bedroom home, that's going to cost you maybe $200,000-300K, right? And the same house that's in San Francisco, that's going to be multiples of millions to get.
Yeah.
But at the same time, let's say it's 5x the cost in San Francisco to buy that house. Your wages and salary is not going to 5x if you move from Kansas City to San Francisco. And you can contest whether that's right or wrong. I think a lot of companies would go out of business if that's what wages did. But that's kind of the key difference, where we can't just base it off of cost of living, because for someone like me, when I go into a negotiation with someone and they use cost of living as a basis, it's a slippery slope. Even looking at San Francisco as a whole, if someone chooses to live alone in downtown San Francisco in a penthouse and they have 2 cars, their cost of living is going to be substantially different from someone who lives in Berkeley in a 1-bedroom apartment that they share with a roommate. And so considering that, if they're doing the same work and performing the same, it's not fair to pay one more than the other, which is why cost of labor becomes so crucial to understand, because that's what you're negotiating off of.
Yep.
Right.
Yeah. And we've started, and I mean, we actually added, so in our data that we collect, we added maybe around a year or a little bit more than a year ago, an option for people to actually select their data as remote. And I think, I mean, we've seen some interesting things there where, some companies have a very different policy, even when it comes to a remote, where they actually, some companies are actually pretty generous in their offers, even for remote employees, where they'll pay pretty close to actually what they're paying in high cost of living areas. And other companies are more strict about maybe the rate that they pay. But it's interesting to see from like a data perspective that we see is like how it's changing across remote. And I'm actually excited for this year. I think we'll start to see a lot more of those trends. And I think the verdict is still out in terms of how companies are fully reacting and stuff to this. But I do think that we'll see some interesting insights this year from the data on that.
Yeah. Yeah. And I definitely think it hinges on company policy, as you mentioned. And because company policies can, just vastly vary. But in terms of like, if you like, we were talking about how it's confusing. If you kind of look at like the different categories there's like in office or like at HQ, I guess, rather. And obviously that's not really like a option now, but like, maybe later, but there's remote, then there's satellite office or like, and so compensation by location can be split into those different categories. So like, for example, if we were to look at Omaha, we can kind of see companies paying in like, at offices there versus, companies outside of that, like the HQ not being there and satellite office not being there, what people are paying remote. And I think those values could differ. And it's interesting also because, companies are starting to publish different percentiles for different like venues, different locations, and for specifically remote work. And one thing that's interesting is, obviously these multinational companies like Google, Facebook, Microsoft, they all have presences across the world, across the US. But companies that didn't have that presence are starting to explore that now. So like startups, mid-sized companies, they're starting to see like, okay, they're starting to define like what their percentiles are going to be for different locations. And I think that's interesting. And that's where we're going to see a lot of kind of new insight over this coming year. And yeah, I think that's something we want to even publish like a report about in the future, potentially.
Yeah. Well, you guys have, I know you just published your 2020 report, which I can imagine was pretty interesting in the year of COVID.
Yeah.
Are you seeing any like high level trends or things that were kind of interest for this year?
One interesting thing to me was if you look at, for example, the entry level roles for engineering, a lot of the highest paying companies, or actually no FANG kind of company was in the highest kind of paying company list for entry level. And I think we're starting to see a lot of mid-sized companies. And these aren't small companies by any means. There are still large companies, but we're starting to see like these kind of new companies starting to pay very competitively. And I think we'll start to see like kind of more of that throughout like the next few years as well. And if you look at like our list, you'll see like companies like, for example, Roblox, Netflix, and Netflix like in the more senior kind of role because they only have senior. But like, some of these are direct results like DoorDash of the pandemic because, it kind of influenced their business. And it's interesting to see like it will be interesting to see whether that holds and whether, compensation market just goes up as a whole because of all of that as a result, or if it kind of generally continues or goes back down, or we don't know, right? Like it's kind of up in the air in some sense right now. And in addition, I guess, in addition to those findings, we also did kind of a report on location and just median pay by different locations across the US and across the world. And it's just interesting to see, I guess, the list of cities and that we can drop the link or something, but there's there's a whole bunch of different cities that are becoming tech hubs now, and it's interesting to explore the cost of living / cost of labor kind of debate in all of these different locations. Like one interesting one is Pittsburgh, right? Like no one kind of expected Pittsburgh to be like a very top location, but it's the compensation market there is very much defined by the kind of large players in the auto industry, or the automotive kind of autonomous driving space. And so and so we have compensation kind of defined by that, and obviously the academic influence of CMU being there as well. So it's fascinating to see that in the data. Whereas, if you were just looking at cost of living, you might not realize that, right? It's from looking at Pittsburgh.
And I think as companies go more remote, or as companies become more distributed, something to realize is as companies move to these different areas, that also means that there's more availability for employees to potentially, there's more different options that they could choose from companies, right? And that affects the cost of labor, that affects the that has an impact on the market, right? And those things can move at a pretty quick pace, as we're seeing in this year, right? And so I think we're really excited, actually, in some ways, to actually see this data and evolve in this year, because I think we'll start to see a lot of different trends in terms of how COVID has really impacted things, not just in the Bay, but also all across the US and even potentially across the world in terms of pay.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, probably the top question we get with companies coming on is, how are you going to handle, the remote locations? And our answer, we're fortunate in the way that we've set up our system and our database, where we can track how pay differs across regions. So we can pull in with accuracy, hey, for a software engineer in this region, for this company size and this type of market, you can probably expect to pay X. And we help build this out for companies. And that's part of why we're so excited to partner with you guys, because to your point, the industry moves quickly. And I'll hop over a little bit because I saw there was a QA that kind of came in on this. But when we look at the real-time data versus the traditional survey data, I always have this like mixed bag about how to use it, where I talk with people about it's best to take the real-time data, layer it onto your survey data so that you can hone in a bit more specifically. What I love about the Levels data is I can look in and see, what does Amazon pay for software engineers? And that's data you can't get from the normal surveys. It's all anonymized. You're not able to sell or publish that. And so I have this honed in view of what a competitor is doing, and I can do it one time, and then I can use the real-time data as a guiding force throughout the year, which I think is maybe the most scientific way, because you basically have your control group and then you can see the indicators of what is actually fluctuating over that year. And that's why I think is so powerful about having our partnership with you guys, because I want my companies to understand if, we're not closing candidates anymore, something's going wrong, to have access to that data that they can then see, there's a spike, it looks like the FANG companies went out there and decided to go bonanzas on this level of engineer, which does happen, that'll show up. And I think that's really cool. And so kind of to use that as a segue, we're about at the time for QA. I would love to, after this call, maybe push out your guys' recent data, state of the market from 2020. We're excited to kind of see that for next year too. But for anyone who's on the call, you should see a QA button at the bottom where you can add some questions. And I saw that there was a couple that came into the chat that my team will move over into our actual QA. So I will pull up this QA right now, and I'll just go in order. We can skip around though. We'll make sure to get to as many of these as I can, but you guys can keep funneling them in there and we'll come across them. But the first question that we had, and I saw this one come in when we were talking about leveling with Levels.fyi. So they're asking, do you help candidates assess which level they are? If so, how?
We publish our standard on the website. So in terms of helping candidates assess, I think part of it's on the candidate to figure out what they are doing at their current company, right? What are the roles and what are the typical tasks that you're doing at your current company, right? And so you can actually go to levels.fyi/standard, and you'll see the standard track that we've come up with. And if you click on, any of the levels, you'll actually see a description for it. And so you can actually match up with the description, whether it matches up with the kind of roles and things that you're doing. And I think that can probably help you assess which level that you may be at.
Yeah, totally. And I think, if you need more professional help, because it is kind of general, we generalize it to all the companies that we have leveling for, the kind of scope and responsibilities. But if you want more professional help, our negotiation service kind of helps with that as well. If you're going through the negotiation process too and would like help with that, we have specific recruiters that, could help with just using your previous experience to match you to the correct level at the corresponding company that you're applying to.
Awesome. We'll mark that over. Oh, the next question we have is, how do you validate, authenticate voluntary submissions by the candidates or portal users?
Cool. Yeah, so we have, there's 3 ways that we collect data. One is people submitting their data manually inside, they're just filling out a form basically on our website. The second way, the second and third way is the way that we actually do the verification. And the second way is that we ask users to upload their W-2 statements, their offer letters, any sort of proof document that we can use to verify what their compensation is. We've also seen things like promotion statements. So when you get promoted, sometimes you'll have a document saying what your comp increased to, things like that. So we have all sorts of documents that we see and we collect. And the third way is through our negotiation service, which is more recent, we're actually getting exposed to tons of offers that people are receiving. And that's another way that we use to ensure that our data is kind of in line. And so the way that we look at it is, now I will say that our second and third means that we collect data, those are smaller in comparison to the first way. Majority of people will submit their offer just filling out the form on our site. But the way that we look at it is the verified data we treat as anchors to ensure that the rest of our data is in line. We'll never, not everyone's obviously comfortable sharing their offer letter and things like that. And so by using the offer letters and things as anchors, we're able to get pretty accurate ranges. We've actually had a call with, it was funny, we had a call with, I can't say the name, but a pretty large tech company, and they literally were going over their compensation numbers with us for each level. And they were like, yep, this looks right, this looks right. This one looks slightly off, maybe just like a little bit. And they were actually helping us adjust the ranges. But for the most part, they were actually surprised at how accurate and in line our numbers were with what it was actually at the company. And so we believe, and we've heard from folks that our data is actually in line based on the system that we have in place.
Yeah, and also like we do the same thing for benefits and leveling. So we collect leveling rubrics, we collect the benefits portion of people's offers and kind of publish those. But yeah, that's definitely Zaheer touched on everything for compensation.
Awesome. Which, to be clear with everyone, we love that you guys do the validations. I've followed you guys for a while just because your posts will show up in my inbox as a comp manager a lot of times of, I follow Levels. And I'm always like, oh, okay, like, let me go see how close we are. And the validations made it really, really powerful. So just a little shout out for that. And all right, the next question is, given the cost of labor versus living topic, how do compensation bands look for remote employees post-COVID? How do they factor in cost of labor in their chosen area, or just cost of labor for general remote employees, since that employee is competing with someone in any location? So I'll tackle that first and see if you guys have anything to add for it. But for remote employees, we do look at the general cost of labor. There's a couple interesting ways I've seen companies tackling this. One company actually is basing it off of the most premium metro in the state will define the wage for that state. So the example would be if it's between Dallas and Austin and Texas to set the wage. If Austin is the top paying or, top cost of labor metro, that's the one that they chose to set the wages for the entire state. And then that's basically what determined what each state would get paid. That's what I believe most people will be doing some form of when they create these ranges. It does get very complicated very quickly. The difference between if you're in Austin or in rural Texas, the cost of labor is significantly different. But for a team, there's a lot of overhead to manage that. So when I go into a company, I'm trying to strike the balance between accuracy and low overhead on it, because I have to create it, one, I have to maintain it, two, and three, I have to explain it to employees, and nothing is worse than having to say, hey, there's 170 different geos. They're all split by zip code or county, and you can tell me where you want to live. And that gets really messy, because then what if you move? Like, what if you change apartments and your apartment's in a different county and suddenly do we change your comp? So there's many, that's just to highlight, there's many things that will make that more complex. But I believe that most companies, from what I've seen, will stick to localizing people's pay. Everyone is kind of holding their breath to see what happens to the data, because we don't know if things will normalize out as software engineers go across the country. I was laughing about this with Zaheer and Zuhayeer, because I would love to see a company that's going to go to their software engineers and say, hey, I'm going to cut your pay 30% because you moved to Nebraska. I don't think that's going to happen. So I think that the average wage for certain roles will increase in states. And I think that's what a lot of other companies are doing or believing. So they'll just probably follow the same process with better data. I don't know if you guys have seen anything different. That's just my projection right now.
Yeah, no, that's kind of in line with what I've seen as well.
Awesome.
Yeah.
And I see another question for you guys. Great follow-up practice regarding validation of comp numbers. Have you also sought validation of your grade leveling for comp professionals or companies, given that they do leveling when submitting comp into Radford or any comp survey consultant?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I think it goes back to of how we verify. Even on leveling, as Zaheer mentioned, we seek out verified information whenever possible. So collecting the leveling rubrics. We've had several companies also reach out to us directly and ask about how we do leveling and whether we can adjust leveling potentially based on some information that they give us, right? So we've actually worked with companies directly to adjust leveling at times if it's incorrect. The thing to note here that I also want to call out is that leveling is kind of, in a lot of ways, it's a rough guide. In the sense that there's so many variables here for an individual. You can never get 100% on the dot comparisons. There's always different factors and variables that'll come into play. So for example, how a person does during the interviews, what their past experience was. And this could be something like, oh, they worked on a very complex thing at a good company, or maybe they were working, even if it was a good company in the past, maybe the type of work that they were doing on their team wasn't as complex or wasn't as up to par at a level, right? So there's so many of these variables, and so it's never going to be 100%, and that goes for any solution or thing when you're combining levels. But we do the best that we can, and we try to back it up with all the verified sources that we can get, whether it's a leveling rubric or the company directly, talking to hiring managers, looking at anecdata like data points. So looking at data points of people actually transferring companies and seeing, let's say a Google E5 or sorry, a Google L5 goes to Facebook E5 or something like that, right? So taking that all of that into consideration.
Yeah, and I think the attendee also asked about kind of the comp survey information, and kind of to touch on that a little bit. We take a very fluid approach to leveling because we think it really differs across companies, and that's why there's a necessity for our site in some sense. And so we don't like to bucket it into kind of rigid kind of structures. We like to put percentiles on each level, and you can kind of see this through our partnership, I think, with Pequity. Like if you go into Pequity and then import our data, you'd be able to kind of see where the different levels would kind of fall into place. But yeah, we kind of have a more fluid kind of structure, and that's why we don't, I guess we created our own standard instead of adopting kind of Radford.
And to weigh into that too, I think that there's a lot of pros to kind of doing that. Radford, like I said, I forget at Google how many levels there were. It's like 10 or something. And Radford only has 6. So that means that they had to go in and shove a couple levels into a single one. So it could obviously inflate some of those comps a little bit. And that's true of any survey. They have to have like a set template that they have to fit all those companies into. So what I like about what you guys do is pull all that data into yours and kind of keep it fluid of saying we see generally these are the pay expectations and how the levels align with these companies. It's not fitting into a set framework just to show up on our site. This is how it aligns by the data itself, which is pretty unique. And that's useful for someone like me because I generally know from consulting and working with a lot of these companies how they like to look at what a senior role is. And most companies, for instance, will peg either starting at their junior or their mid role where most of the employees sit, and they build their ranges out from there to say, how do we want to stack this out? Having a tool like yours helps validate that, and that makes it easier to build. So when we do get your data into our system, we can create levels that are custom to the company that also match their competitors and make it easier to close those candidates in. So small sell for that partnership. It also goes into another question that someone else asked about. Can you talk about how your Levels.fyi solution validates your crowdsourced data that sits behind your solution? How often is the company willing to help you verify the inputs you receive?
Yeah, I wouldn't say it's not super common, but it happens pretty often. And a lot of times it's not. Some companies are hesitant, and we've had all sorts of interesting channels. So we've had people kind of unofficially, not on behalf of the company, kind of come to us and help us with those changes, right? At the same time, we've had companies officially come to us, or in some cases, if they have to get approval from a VP or whatever, they'll a lot of times they want it to be, they don't want people to know that they're working with us necessarily in some cases, right? And so we've had a lot of like off the record conversations and whatnot. So I wouldn't say it's frequent by any means, but it's not uncommon either. Like it does happen. And just because a company is not engaging with us doesn't mean that we aren't able to get verified information, right? Because we look at so many different things, a lot of which is public as well, right? Looking at anecdotal data points of how people are actually moving across levels and whatnot.
Yeah, and I think at the end of the day, both companies and candidates want accurate information.
Mhm.
And so providing accurate information helps both parties kind of, find like where they can meet. And so it has, like, for more competitive companies, it's actually been really helpful because it's a recruiting tool almost, right?
Mhm.
To have like their accurate bands up there so that, people who are considering moving can consider their company. So in that sense, I think it's interesting to see like the companies that are coming and reaching out to us and kind of actively trying to work with us.
Yeah. And to the point of what we see, with our customers who use the levels data, the way that I always explain and describe it to them is you're kind of going for precision versus like the hive mind. If you go to the Radford option impact data, it's the hive mind of the Bay Area. You can see what everyone has collectively decided is the average for a software engineer. But if you want to know what Facebook is paying for an L3 software engineer, you're not going to get that from Radford or Option Impact because they have an obligation to those companies who's submitting and purchasing the data where they're not going to reveal the name, they're not going to show their level structure, and they're not going to list individuals. They're going to aggregate that behind it. And they do a lot of weighting and algorithms and things into it so that it provides its own form of statistical accuracy, right? Where, like I said, you're calculating the hive mind. But if you wanted to know that one data point on Facebook, which has its own very powerful implication for you, because that might be exactly the person that you just lost out to last week, that's where levels comes in and it makes it super powerful, which is why I think the layering of the two is so unique. And that's, I don't know, I like to use it because I can usually also say, like, look, here's like all these offers from Facebook, here's your ranges, this is where you fall within it, and it's good. It just provides that confidence, to your point.
Yeah, definitely. I think Pequity does like a good job of the marriage of the two, because ideally you want both pieces of information. You want kind of survey information. You want specific information. You want to make your own judgment by going through kind of all of that. And I
Mhm.
think the interface Pequity provides is like basically the marriage of the two, which is really nice. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And this ties into more questions on the data. Can you shed some light on base compensation and OTE breakout for enterprise sales positions? Ooh, sales comp, my favorite. I've had some difficulty understanding the current sales comp listed on Levels.fyi, as some of the roles look like technical and non-sales positions.
Yeah, definitely. I think for us, we're actively working on different kind of structures like OTE, for example. We don't have implemented specifically yet. It's something that we still consider bonus. And so, working on target earnings, whether that's the percentage and the actual like target that you're trying to hit for each quarter or year, we're working on like a structure for that. And we definitely want to kind of accommodate for different roles. That said, like, yeah, the sales information that we have right now is kind of, there are technical sales roles and they do get equity in a lot of places. And so there are different kind of pieces there. And we try to highlight that as much as possible right now. And that's sort of what we have on the site. People can view kind of the sales information across like basically the three kind of elements, which is base salary, stock, and bonus. And we imagine like, people are putting their OTE in kind of the bonus category, but we want to make that more explicit for sure.
Gotcha. That makes sense. Another question that just came in from Trish: how would you recommend finding comp info for someone moving into a new role, but within the same organization?
New role, interesting. I think so. I mean, I think all the traditional kind of methods apply here. So I'm assuming this is from like a candidate or from an employee perspective. We have lots of data on our site. If you go to levels.fyi, you'll see we don't just have software engineering. We actually have all sorts of roles now: product management, sales, data science, all sorts of roles. So you can definitely take a look on there to find competence information. The other thing is that, even if you don't have data for a particular organization, like if you don't see data for a particular organization, you can kind of generally get a sense of how much a company pays by looking for that role. What I would suggest is, for example, if you determine that at your company maybe is paying top of market or mid market or whatnot, you can look at other companies that are, or similar companies that pay, within that same pay range, and look at the comp for those companies as well, right? So even if there isn't enough data for your specific organization out there, look at companies that pay similarly, and look at the data for those roles as well.
Yeah, and I do think there is a distinction between kind of new offer and moving within like an organization. So I do want to provide like, I guess, that distinction. And one way that you could observe, like maybe filter through our data, is by using your years of experience. So if you have like a set number of years of experience, you can filter to that number of years at the company. So we have two filters. You can filter how many years someone's been at a company and how many years of experience someone has. And so you can kind of play with those levers to kind of see, what the compensation looks like for your particular role or level.
Yeah. And just to add some insights too, transfers are interesting from a compensation standpoint. Generally speaking, if your comp is in line somewhere in that range, it's probably rare that they will give you an increase unless you're significantly below the range or below peers. And the reason for that usually comes down to you interviewed in, you're kind of like a new hire, and they're probably not certain of performance yet. And they're going to try and fit you in with other individuals at the company. And it's a lateral move a lot of times when you're doing a transfer. So it doesn't always come with an increase, which can sometimes be shocking for people. But what I do generally see and often recommend with a manager who would go through this is they should go to the comp cycle and record the performance and see if that person should be caught up. That's not to say, again, like they will catch you up to the band. There's almost every company has that process where people have to be in range. But when you are looking at these compensations, if you do look at the similar levels, especially if it's like similar roles, an example might be a software engineer transferring to a PM role. There may not be a comp change. because they have that significantly similar kind of technical expertise that might be needed. The leveling might be similar. Those kinds of elements exist. And in those cases, what you see may look like your own comp, and that is completely normal. And that would be what I would expect from the Levels.fyi data in those cases. But if it is switching ladders and you're going from, like, for lack of a great example, an executive assistant to a software engineer, you would see some sort of extreme pay difference. So I like to call that out because it is, within my own world, a common question with transfers. And then we have just 2 other questions here. So I'll go through the first one at the bottom so I can end on one for you Levels boys. But so data is useful. However, how do you build a comp program from the data? You usually have to, for a lot of companies, bring in a comp analyst or a specialist if you aren't familiar with comp data. Generally speaking, if you have a statistical background, you can use compensation data with some certainty, but there are best practices out there to help you create ranges. If you are at all curious, we do that for companies, or we help provide them with templates to kick them off, because we know that compensation can cripple your company if you don't do it well at the early stages, and it can also not cripple your company, but cause a lot of headaches down the road. But when we say a data-driven compensation program, it is coming from this place of, we want to know what that hive mind is for the market, what is the real-time data for what's actually happening, marry them together. We want to find what the common leveling structures are, the performance structures are, and then map that to your company. So we're going in surgically. Usually what you should do is look at how your company compares to other competitors. How are you growing? What is your revenue looking like? What will be your budget? And those are the factors that go into a data-driven comp program. So it can get quite nuanced, but it doesn't have to be. There are ways to automate it, which is why we focused in on what we're building with Pequity, to build your comp programs from the ground up and provide you with equitable and confident pay structures. So little bit on that one. And then to end on what the Levels guys might find it's a fun question. What data is the most requested type of data from Levels.fyi?
Guess you can dissect that question in a few ways.
Okay.
Yeah.
Take it the most interesting route.
Yeah. I guess what is the most requested type of data that we don't have is how I guess I might answer it, and we're going to work towards this year is probably international presence, specifically for EU, for kind of different heavy international locations for the tech industry. Singapore is like a major hub as well. So we want to get that right, and we want to do it in native local currency for these international locations. And so that's like a huge effort for us this year.
Mm-hmm.
We're trying to accommodate our forms so that we can collect things, in GBP and EU, and if stock's in USD, then we want to collect in USD, and just navigating all those little nuances that there is with compensation internationally. And I think that'll actually be a huge challenge for us, but I'm kind of excited for it. So that's how I'll answer the question, but I'll let Zaheer close off with his interpretation too.
Yeah, I was looking at the normal way, or not the normal way, but just the simplistic way, I guess, of salaries is what came to mind for me, right? Pay data in general is the most requested type of information, and it naturally makes sense, right? It's a very personal, it's a very intimate kind of thing for folks, right? How much they're getting paid, affects every part of their life, all of that, right? I think in some cases it has kind of almost, it's like a taboo topic for a lot of people, but at the same time, like for us, we've gotten very comfortable of obviously talking about it as having worked with Levels.fyi, but it's something that's huge and central to people, right? And getting pay right, not just from a candidate perspective about educating people, but also from a company perspective and paying people right. I think that really is what both of our missions are at Pequity and Levels.fyi. And I think, we're both out to make pay better for people, and we realize and recognize that it's central to people's lives, not just, from a business perspective, but from a very deeply personal perspective.
Mm-hmm.
And, I'm number one, I'm really excited for this partnership because I think our missions align so well. But I also think that we have I do think that we can make a big difference. So yeah, I'm super excited, and thanks for having us on.
Oh, do you want to spell for me, Zaheer? That's awesome. Thank you guys
Yeah.
so much for joining us. For everyone who's still on the call, we will be sending out this recording after with some more resources too from the Levels.fyi guys, also on Pequity. But thank you, Zaheer and Zuhayeer. Love the conversation, and also looking forward to working with you guys in the future here.
Yeah,
Yeah,
appreciate it.
absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
But Zaheer, do you have the beekeeping facility like near your house, or do you have to go to it?
It's near my house actually. So it's actually not my parents' house, and so they have a pretty nice backyard. So it's like it's spaced out a little bit. But to be honest, you can come like a foot away from the hive and nothing really happens. Like it's really only if they're angry where they would sting you. So
That's
yeah.
great. Is it like, and this is a very like uneducated question, but are there like specific types of honeybees? Do you have a like California
Yes.
specific? Okay.
Yeah, there actually are. I was surprised, but you can get different varieties. You can get like there's Italian honeybees, you can get Russian honeybees, and like they each have their own like characteristics. So it's funny because like yeah, it's interesting. Like some of them will be like aggressive honeybees, and then like others will be different. And it's just like I never knew that there were like different cultures of or varieties of honeybees like that. So
What's your honeybee culture?
mine are Italians. So I have Italian honeybees, and they're known for being like gentle generally. So it's
All
nice because they don't sting as much or things like that.
right. We're a fan of Italy. So
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
and did you have to ship? I assume you had to ship them in, which seems weird.
Yeah, well, I've gotten it shipped one. The first time I got honeybees, I got it shipped to me, but then afterwards, like once you have a running hive, then you kind of just catch a swarm. So like just by nature, like you don't have to buy bees really. You can just catch a swarm, and so I found that out later that I can just like catch a swarm. I don't have to actually buy a hive again. So it's interesting. It's kind of fascinating that you just like catch a swarm of bees from out in the wild from somewhere.
Oh,